Welcome to Babel, Translating the Middle East, a podcast from the Middle East program at CSIS. Here on Babel, we take you beyond the headlines to take a closer look at what's happening in the Middle East and why it matters. This week on Babel, I speak with Ambassador Karim Haggag. After an Egyptian diplomatic career that spanned more than 25 years, he's now a professor of practice at the American University in Cairo's School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, the director of the university's Middle East Studies Center, and a non-resident visiting scholar with the Harvard Kennedy School. We compare the war in Gaza to other crises in Egypt's history, discuss Egypt's complicated relationships with Israel and Hamas, and anticipate Israel's role in the day after in Gaza. Then I continue the conversation with Natasha and Leah Hickert to discuss U.S. diplomatic leverage in the Middle East. To translate some of what's happening in the Middle East, this is Babel. Karim Haggag, welcome to Babel.
Thank you, John. Thank you for having me. It's great to be with you.
Egypt's had a security focus on the Israeli border since the creation of Israel in 1948. Help us understand the context. How does the current Egyptian concern over Gaza rank among the various crises that Egypt has felt on its border with Israel over the last 75 years?
This is a fundamentally different challenge than the large-scale armed conflicts that Egypt has fought with Israel over the years, the last one being the 1973 October War. What we have in Gaza is a different situation. We have a resumption of serious armed conflict between a major Palestinian faction, Hamas, and Israel. Egypt has had to deal with wars between Hamas and Gaza since Hamas took over the Gaza Strip in 2007. We've had about 4 or 5 rounds of armed conflict between both parties. This time was different. This time, the scale of the conflict posed real challenges for Egypt. From the beginning, we had the prospect of the forced displacement of Palestinians into Egypt. This was a declared Israeli objective from the beginning. Egypt viewed this with tremendous alarm, framed this as a red line for Egyptian security. In addition, the fact that we have a major Palestinian-Israeli confrontation on Egypt's borders poses political problems for Egypt, Egypt being seen as the major Arab country that can be supportive of Gaza's population. Added to that, we've had real tensions between Egypt and Israel over the flow of humanitarian assistance into Gaza. The Rafah border crossing was, of course, the main conduit for that. Israel bombed the Rafah border repeatedly throughout this conflict and threatened to bomb humanitarian convoys entering Gaza through Rafah. So there was real tension there. And then we have an emerging reality in Gaza that I think will pose serious challenges both for Egypt and for the Egyptian-Israeli relationship. I think Secretary Blinken summarized this well in his remarks a few weeks ago, in which he said that what we have in Gaza is the potential of a serious insurgency. We have no exit plan for the IDF from Gaza, so we have a situation in which the Israeli military will be in Gaza for the foreseeable future. We have a compounded humanitarian crisis, and we can potentially have a collapse in governance. So we might have Hamas, remnants of Hamas in Gaza, but no one actually governing Gaza. I think the spillover effects of that into Egypt are quite serious, in terms of the chaos, in terms of the militancy that can spill over into the Sinai. And I think that reality will pose tremendous complications between Egypt and Israel as to how to manage that reality. This crisis really presents a number of challenges to Egypt, and it just shows the complexity of the situation that Egypt has had to grapple with.
I'm wondering where the Egyptian public is on this. There has never been a lot of Egyptian warmth toward Israel. Is there now greater hostility to Israel? Is there a mobilization of the public? Is the government trying to use public opinion in any way to advance its interests, either vis-a-vis the border, in the Arab world, vis-a-vis the United States. Where is the Egyptian public and what does it mean?
From the beginning, the Egyptian public has been wholeheartedly sympathetic with the plight of the Palestinians in Gaza. The images emerging from Gaza were deeply disturbing. I think the sheer scale of the violence perpetrated by the Israeli military against civilians in Gaza was truly horrific. And yes, it touched a deep chord within Egyptian national consciousness, which has always been pro-Palestinian. And then coupled with that has been, I think, a deep frustration as to the inability, not just of Egypt, but the entire international community to bring this war to a close. The fact that we've seen the failure of the international community to alleviate the serious humanitarian disaster in Gaza, the failure to reach a ceasefire, the failure to hold Israel accountable for the violations of humanitarian and international law, all of that has really built up what I think has been a tremendous amount of resentment and frustration on the part of Egyptian public opinion. That said, there is a recognition that this crisis is complex, that it does have serious implications for Egypt. So the frustration and the sympathy for the Palestinians has been coupled with a wariness or a recognition that Egypt has to tread carefully in this crisis.
As you and I have both witnessed, there's been a lot of cooperation for decades between the Egyptian military and the Israeli military, especially on Sinai security issues. Are you surprised, as I am, that there hasn't been more of an ability for the two militaries to strike more accommodations between each other throughout this conflict?
Yes, I think it has been surprising. These are highly professional individuals from the security services on both sides. There's been a buildup of deep cooperation there over the years, and they manage this complex relationship in a very pragmatic and reasonable manner, which is why it was quite a rude awakening from the very beginning of the conflict that Egyptians and Egyptian security officials were quite taken aback by these calls for the forced displacement of Palestinians into Egypt, solving Israel's Gaza problem in Egypt. And that's been a long-standing approach of Israeli national security thinkers, are finding the solution for Gaza in Egypt. So all of a sudden, we were faced with the reality that, as opposed to the decades of constructive cooperation between both militaries, we had an Israeli side that was completely cavalier about Egyptian national security interests. And that was certainly disturbing. This is what prompted Egypt to frame this specific issue as a red line for Egypt's national security, and really drive the message home, not just to the Israeli side, but I think in Washington, where we found the Biden administration actually echoing that same red line.
And one of the issues on which cooperation seems to have both ebbed and flowed is on the issue of tunnels under the border. And for a time, the Israelis felt the Egyptians were not doing what they could to stop the tunnels. Then cooperation seemed significantly better and Israeli concerns went away. Israelis have now said there are more than 50 tunnels they found going under the border. And they've talked about needing to permanently occupy, as you mentioned, the Philadelphia corridor to have Israelis on the border between Gaza and Egypt as a way to prevent that smuggling. That would not be consistent with the agreements that Israel signed in the past. As a practiced diplomat who's thought a lot about Egyptian national security, about Arab-Israeli peace issues, is this something you're confident can be worked? And what are the kinds of ways that a compromise can be found on the issue of ensuring there is no smuggling through tunnels on the border?
The tunnel issue has been historically a very challenging one. It's been challenging for both Egypt and Israel. So for decades, when Israel was the occupying power in Gaza, so it was in control of the other side of the border. Israel itself found it very difficult to clamp down on the smuggling and the cross-border tunnels between Egypt and Gaza. It's important to mention that since 2014, Egypt took a very proactive approach on the tunnel issues. There was a recognition that the cross-border smuggling through the tunnels was a major security concern for Egypt. This was a conduit of not only illicit trafficking in goods and people, but also in weapons, also in drugs, also for militancy that spilled over into the Sinai. So Egypt took a very, shall we say, hardline approach in clamping down on the tunnels. Now we have a situation in which the extent of the tunnel network is both wider and deeper than many have acknowledged. And I think the problematic issue is this accusatory tone coming from Israel, pointing a finger of blame on Egypt of not doing enough to clamp down on the tunnels. I think that is not helpful. That I think just raises suspicions on the Egyptian side and will make it harder to find an arrangement. One thing I can say is with the IDF on the other side of the border, in effect, reoccupying Palestinian territory, I think it will be very difficult to find an acceptable arrangement between Egypt and Israel that deals with the whole range of border issues. So border security, including the tunnels, including humanitarian assistance from Egypt into Gaza, the movement of people and goods between both sides. We have to find an arrangement, but it can't be through accepting the reoccupation on the part of Israel of Palestinian territory.
You mentioned the Israeli political leadership many times, and it may be that Israel is evolving in a political direction that poses a new set of challenges for Egypt. There are Israeli politicians calling for expulsion. There are Israeli politicians calling for an Israeli reoccupation of Gaza. How does Egypt respond to an Israeli partner whose parameters are changing in ways that many Egyptians feel is contrary to the years of partnership that Egypt and Israel have built?
With great difficulty. The relationship between Egypt and Israel is a very complex one. And Egypt has, throughout the years, I think, to its credit, learned to adopt what I would argue is a sophisticated approach in managing this relationship. Sophisticated in the sense that we've learned to compartmentalize aspects of this relationship. So on the one level, there is a very pragmatic, as you mentioned, security cooperation between both sides that's grown and matured over the years. On another level, there are serious political differences, specifically on the Palestinian issue. Israel's very controversial position on issues relating to not only Gaza, but also the West Bank, its relationship with the PA, the clear reluctance to move on the political pathway towards a two-state solution. I mean, all of these things really undermine the prospects of a peaceful settlement to the conflict. That has been extremely difficult for Egypt. Now we have this added dimension of very hardline voices seeking to take decisions that can really compromise Egyptian security. And I think that adds a very troubling aspect to the relationship. It's one thing to have political differences over the Palestinian issue. It's another completely different matter when we have an Israeli government that can take positions or adopt approaches that compromise Egypt's national security. So the Egyptian response has been forceful, but at the same time controlled, but clearly communicating to the Israeli side that there are things that Egypt will not accept. Egypt stated very clearly that if there is this prospect of expulsion of Palestinians into Gaza, that will be a real breach in the relationship. That's how we will approach this government. We will deal with it in a pragmatic way when the conditions warrant so, But we will clearly communicate to the Israeli side when we have serious concerns about their actions that affect Egypt's security.
One of the things I'm interested in are your views about the red lines on Hamas's future role in governance in Gaza. Egypt cracked down sharply on the Muslim Brotherhood movement in Egypt, of which Hamas is the Palestinian branch. There are Egyptians who are active with the Brotherhood and other Islamist groups who are in exile because of the government's policy. What are the boundaries that the Egyptian government thinks are appropriate for Hamas's role in Gaza, given the rather strong approach that the government has taken to the Brotherhood's role in Egypt?
Like our relationship with Israel, our relationship with Hamas is also complex. Hamas does belong to a rival ideological movement, the Muslim Brotherhood. So there's been an adversarial relationship on the ideological level and at times on the security level vis-a-vis Hamas. On the other hand, Hamas is the governing body in an adjacent neighboring territory. So there's a pragmatic incentive to deal with Hamas as the entity in charge of Gaza. And on the third level, Hamas is an important element of the broader Palestinian national movement. And in the context of Egypt's overall approach to the Palestinian issue, Hamas is an important partner that Egypt has had to deal with, whether with respect to the objective of achieving Palestinian reconciliation, reunifying Gaza with the West Bank, or mediating the ceasefires during the various rounds of armed conflict between Hamas and Israel. So here again, Egypt has had to compartmentalize its approach to Hamas. So with respect to Hamas's future role in Gaza, from the very beginning, there was deep skepticism that the declared Israeli objective of uprooting Hamas completely from Gaza was achievable. We've been through this so many times. We understand, I think, probably more than most, the extent to which Hamas represents a very deep-seated movement in Gaza. And the only approach you can adopt to deal with Hamas is political. Hence why Egypt has historically placed such a high importance on achieving inter-Palestinian reconciliation, integrating Hamas formally into the Palestinian national movement and the institutions of the PLO. That is the approach that Egypt has adopted during this conflict. If you recall, the very first ceasefire proposal that Egypt put forward, it included this element of inter-Palestinian reconciliation. So from the beginning, there was a recognition that we have to find an approach that addresses what will ultimately be remnants of Hamas in Gaza, in whatever shape or form. That increasingly seems to be a reality which many people are acknowledging, even on the Israeli side, albeit reluctantly. So Hamas will remain a reality in Gaza that we have to address one way or the other.
How would you address Israelis who say there's no living with Hamas, and what we've seen from Egypt's own experience is the government's determination that you can't live with political Islam, and they are asking us to do what they refused to do themselves? There was no reconciliation in Egypt. There was suppression of the Muslim Brotherhood. Is this different?
You correctly point to Egypt's, I think, unique experience with the Muslim Brotherhood. And that has been a very difficult and recently a very painful chapter in Egypt's history. Egypt has not taken the approach of exporting that model in its dealings with other countries that have parties affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. Egypt does not make a claim of universalizing its approach vis-a-vis the Muslim Brotherhood, whether it's in Tunis, whether it's in Morocco, whether it's in Jordan, whether it's in Syria. The reality remains that there is no military solution to Hamas in Gaza, which is exactly why we as Egypt had to adopt this very pragmatic, compartmentalized approach. We have no illusions about Hamas. We have learned to deal with it in a very pragmatic way. The fact that the Israeli side has no military solution to Hamas forces us to find another approach. Otherwise, what we will be left with is a situation in which there is no day after. If we have a continuation of the armed conflict, we will not be in a position to get to a point where we can begin reconstruction, where even we can begin to have humanitarian assistance in a sustained way to alleviate the situation in Gaza. So we will have this very troubling outcome in which there will be no end to this war.
Could you foresee an ongoing future Egyptian role in Gaza, not just on the border, allowing humanitarian supplies to come in, but in terms of governance, government support, potentially security? Is there any formula, either with the United States, with international Arab partners, with the Palestinian Authority, in which Egypt would play an ongoing role inside of Gaza?
This is, I think, an issue that security planners are wrestling with in Egypt. So clearly, there has been a reluctance throughout the years to assume that type of role in Gaza. And I think justifiably so. So the wariness stems from the prospect of, if Egypt assumes a role in Gaza, especially when it comes to providing security and governance, then we have the prospect of Egypt assuming responsibility for Gaza, which is actually an outcome that has been openly called for by Israeli officials throughout the years, that Egypt should just assume responsibility over Gaza and basically take over the burden of providing security and governance in the Gaza Strip. That said, there is a recognition and a sense of responsibility of addressing what I just described as this very problematic outcome in Gaza. I mean, the worst of all worlds in Gaza. And so to alleviate that eventuality, there is thinking of what can Egypt contribute to a potential plan to deal with the aftermath in Gaza. I think whatever that contribution is, it will have to be in the context of a clear multilateral framework. So yes, if there is an international force that is mandated by the United Nations Security Council to provide security and governance in Gaza, then Egypt can think of having a role within that context. The other condition I think that will be very important for Egypt is that whatever arrangement we have for Gaza is tied to a clear pathway towards a two-state solution. Egypt cannot be seen as being a party to an arrangement in which it is a subcontractor for Israel's continued occupation of Gaza. We need to connect whatever arrangement is put in place for Gaza back to a pathway for two states.
You've spent a lot of time thinking about U.S.-Egyptian relations. You've watched it. You've participated in those relations. What do you make of the U.S. role? Is the U.S. playing an effective role? Is it not doing enough to persuade Israel? Is the U.S. not doing enough to help Egypt? How would you grade the administration's approach, not necessarily the outcomes, but the actions?
So I will give you very much a personal assessment. From the beginning, the way the administration has framed this conflict was extremely problematic, bringing back the language associated with the war on terror, that Hamas is ISIS, that Hamas is pure evil, signing off to a very expansive, unbounded view of this conflict. And I think that set the stage for Prime Minister Netanyahu's approach of total victory against Hamas, this unconditional or unbounded objective that could be realized by military means. And we've seen, as a result, what some have referred to as the bear hug approach by the administration for this Israeli government. And that resulted in some very problematic optics. So we had the President of the United States sitting in on the meetings of the Israeli War Cabinet, followed, of course, by the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. The optics of this reflected that the administration was actually part of this conflict. And so people associate in a very close way the administration with all of the atrocities that have taken place by the Israeli military in Gaza. And they don't hear the voices of concern that emanated from the administration about Palestinian lives, the need to adopt a more measured approach by Israel towards this conflict. And so that, I think, took a real toll on the administration's standing. Finally, yes, you've seen an approach by which the administration sets these red lines on a number of issues, completely ignores when the Israeli side runs through those red lines, and therefore leads to great skepticism as to what the administration can actually do constructively to bring this conflict to an end, and then move to a day after approach that can bring some hope to Gaza and hopefully move in a proactive way towards a two-state outcome, which the administration claims is its ultimate objective. There's real skepticism now about the credibility of the United States with respect to this conflict, and even the moral standing of this administration when it comes to everything we've seen coming out of Gaza.
We have an election in November whose outcome is unclear. The polling suggests the likelihood of a return of a Trump presidency is increasing. How does that shape the approaches of all the participants in these negotiations over the coming 5 months? Does it create a sense of urgency? Does it create a sense of passivity? How does this affect the prospects for near-term and longer-term solutions?
It's quite hard to say how this factors into decision-making. On the one hand, if you are an Israeli prime minister that finds it tremendously difficult to make the political decisions and the compromises to end the war, then it probably would make sense for Netanyahu to wait for a new administration. So buying time, looking to the November elections, hoping that the outcome will alleviate him of making these difficult decisions. I doubt the elections factor into the calculus of Hamas. And certainly because of the immediacy and the urgency of the issues facing Egypt, there's certainly no sense that we can wait for the November elections to start addressing this very difficult reality emanating from Gaza. Now, with respect to the broader U.S.-Egyptian relationship, I don't get the sense that Egypt has any partisan preference as to who controls the White House. We will deal with Democratic and Republican administrations alike. Unlike, interestingly enough, the Israeli-U.S. relationship, which seems to be becoming more and more partisan. I don't think Egypt is in a position to actually adopt that approach. The Egyptian-American relationship is too important to make it a partisan issue.
Karim Haggag, thank you very much for joining us on Babel.
Thank you, John, for having me.
Has the United States had the amount of diplomatic success in Gaza that you'd expect? Why or why not?
It certainly has had much less success than it expected. I think that's partly because the Israeli side of the equation has proved more difficult than a lot of Americans thought it would be, certainly than President Biden thought it would be. The Hamas side was always going to be difficult, but I think the U.S. has also had difficulty on the Arab side. There was sort of an assumption that the U.S. had that the Arabs would be able to maneuver the Palestinian side, the Hamas side, and partly because of very strained relations between Arab states and the Palestinian Authority, partly because of, in many cases, hostility between Arab states and Hamas. Getting all the pieces to line up has been almost like a Rubik's Cube, and you move two things into the right place and three things fall out of place. It's remarkable to me that in many ways the U.S. has been at the center of diplomacy, but the diplomacy hasn't made nearly the kind of progress that Americans anticipated it would and that the rest of the world has expected the U.S. to be able to do.
I think it's hard to say that it's been successful. I mean, we're still talking about this 9 months later, and we were seriously talking about a ceasefire in February. So it's hard to say that there's been a lot of successes. The conflict has spilled over into the region in really unfortunate ways, impeding maritime traffic in the Red Sea. You have an impending possible war between Hezbollah and Israel. You have skyrocketing settler violence. It was just made public today that the Israeli government made the largest land seizure in the West Bank in over 3 decades. And then if you just look at Gaza, it's horrific. I mean, we have 38,000 people dead, according to a UN official, more children killed in Gaza in 4 months compared to 4 years of wars all over the world combined. And the entire world is seeing this in real time. And they're seeing that destruction primarily from US-made weapons. And I think that's a problem because people perceive that leverage from the United States. They perceive that the United States should have more diplomatic successes regardless of whether they do or not. And I think that's a problem over the long term. Obviously, that's a big problem amongst populations across the global south and especially in the Arab world. But I think it's also a problem with regards to China and Russia and significant adversaries because they're looking at this and they're quite happy to sit back and call the U.S. A failure, call it hypocritical. That's significantly problematic as well for the United States.
I guess the real question is, what should our expectations be for the ability to end a war diplomatically if the U.S. wants to end the war? I think we have to accept the fact that combatants have to be the ones who are willing to end wars. And one of the challenging things about this war in particular is it seems to me that the Israeli side feels that the longer they fight, the better the outcome will be. The Hamas side feels the longer they fight, the better the outcome will be for them. And then the question is how the U.S. can introduce urgency, can create a sense of confidence that ending the war will result in a better outcome for one or both sides. And I think that the challenge of this one is that each side feels that ending the war now would be a mistake. And it has an existential need to continue to fight. Given that reality, what are the diplomatic options for the United States? I think it's partly about incentives, punishments, constraining choices. But I think this is a much harder environment than just saying, okay, here's what the deal has to be. You sign up, and we're done. Wars are fought partly to create untenable conditions for one or both of the combatants.
So do you think the United States missed an opportunity for effective diplomatic engagement?
It doesn't really matter what I think for the United States. It matters what everyone else thinks. And most people think that it did. It is the stalwart ally of Israel. It provides most of its weapons. Internal descent cables and many experts and government officials have said that the United States should use its leverage with Israel to get those people to a negotiating table or at least minimize the effects of the war as it goes on. The United States was in long-term debates with Russia and regimes like Syria over siege-like conditions and getting aid in. And now we're seeing famine-like conditions in Gaza because the U.S.'s stalwart ally is not allowing aid in. Again, I think perception is important, but I also think, to Jon's point, which is an excellent one, when you do have two sides that just think it's better to fight another day and everyone else thinks that that's a bad idea, how do you get them to perceive the consequences of fighting another day as worse than establishing some kind of peace or at least ceasefire?
And the other challenge is, particularly when you have a Democratic partner, and you have to consider not only the intended effects of what you do, but the unintended effects on a polity. Would an Israel that felt totally abandoned be more likely to be more pliable to the kind of thinking Natasha's describing? Or would there be a double down, never again, this is us and an existential threat, we have to fight and the gloves are off, and we will, as not only Israelis have sometimes described it to me, but Russians have described the war in Syria and others, that you just have to go through this paroxysm of intense violence. And if you just do that, take the gloves off, then the problem goes away. Would that put us in a better position? I think it's really difficult because clearly Israeli public opinion has moved to the right as a consequence of this war. What American actions over what period of time would move Israeli opinion not even to the left, but more to the center? I have a lot of humility about my ability to predict that. I think we should at least acknowledge the possibility that making Israel feel really isolated could have the effect of Israelis backing up and saying, we can't lose our most important ally, or it could have the effect of the Israelis saying, we will go through a bloody period of pain and we will inflict damage and they will never do this to us again. And we could end up with multiples of the number of Palestinians killed from what we have today. Again, I don't know what the answer is. I don't think any of us know, but I think we have to approach the question with a certain amount of humility.
That sounds like a lot of this is about changing outsider perspectives. So how effective has U.S. engagement been with its Arab partners in the past, and how effective can we expect it to be going forward?
I would think that the administration thinks it's been quite successful, actually, on this. None of the Arab partners that had normalized with Israel have pulled out of that. You haven't seen particularly aggressive rhetoric, actually, from any of those states. We're watching as a deal might unfold to demarcate the border between Lebanon and Israel. I'm not sure if I'm as optimistic about that happening or it being necessarily a good thing over the long term, but that's there as well. You had this Iranian attack on Israel using hundreds of missiles and drones a couple months ago, and Arab states came and they protected Israel. They weren't particularly open about it for obvious reasons, but they did. So I think that they would say that they've been particularly effective with Arab engagement. Qatar has been sort of an essential mediator, I think, in all of this. But taking a step back, speaking about having humility, normalization didn't stop this from happening.
It may have provoked it.
It may have even provoked it. Right, exactly. And so I think we need to have a little bit of humility in recognizing not just the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but a lot of the festering wounds in the region as having a great amount of potential to drag the United States back into the region, a region that they want to deprioritize and have wanted to deprioritize for about 15 years now almost. I don't think that's happening now because there's a lot of putting out fires and excitement about, I think, little successes here and there. But I do hope eventually really think about the logic behind U.S. strategy when it came to the Middle East.
It feels to me that most of the Arab states are a bit neutral. They are hostile to Hamas. They have profound reservations about the way the Israelis are prosecuting this war, both in humanitarian terms and in political terms, in terms of their own domestic publics. They haven't wanted to alienate the United States. They want the United States to be successful, but they also think the United States has an ability to bear more costs, and they don't. So I think that they're waiting on the sidelines for the moment to really engage. They don't think it's the time to catalyze a different outcome. They've talked a little bit about the importance of a two-state solution, which if you look at Israeli polling numbers, is a very hard sell in Israel. I think you look at the complexity of shifting American politics and potential new president, it becomes a very murky environment. And as Natasha rightly pointed out, U.S. diplomacy is central to how this is playing out. But there's also a sense of wariness, a sense of tentativeness, a sense that now really isn't the moment to reach out. That may or may not be the right answer, but I think it makes the diplomacy especially hard. And one of the things that has struck me is the administration's tried several times to catalyze diplomatic action. You had the president laying out the parameters of what a deal would look like. The catalyzing hasn't really caught on. The window for that is going to close as we get involved in our own elections, our own politics. In many ways, Arab states are certainly going to have to live with the consequences more than others, but also can't figure out a different structure than relying on the United States to do the right thing. And in some ways, waiting until the United States, in their mind, comes around and does the right thing, and how soon that will be and how effective it will be, how complete that will be, I think is something that remains unclear.
We'll have to see which Arab states stay on the sidelines in the coming months. Thanks for joining me, Jon and Natasha.
Thank you, Leah.
Thanks, Leah.
Thanks for listening to Babel. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find more analysis on this topic linked in the show notes on the CSIS website, and you can find us on Twitter at CSIS Mideast.